25 million ounces of gold, pulled from a single valley in the Colorado Rockies, from ground that every expert said was worthless. At its peak, Cripple Creek was the richest gold field in the history of the Western Hemisphere. It produced more wealth per square mile than any strike California ever made, more than the Klondike, more than anything the South African rand had seen it in its early years. Fortunes worth hundreds of millions of dollars in modern terms were built in this one high-altitude valley. Population 0, elevation 9,500 feet, sitting on what geologists had written off as volcanic rubble unworthy of a single shovel. And then, within the span of 2 decades, the men who built those fortunes used private armies to drive the workers, who dug them out of the state at gunpoint. What followed that expulsion? The slow dissolution of a city of 50,000 into a collection of a few hundred is one of the most complete stories of rise and ruin that the American West ever produced. Not a gradual decline, not a gentle fade, a violent unraveling that began with a labor war as savage as anything the industrialized world had seen, and ended with empty streets, collapsing headframes, and the quiet return of the mountain silence that had been there before the first pick ever struck gold. But here is the thing that makes Cripple Creek different from every other gold rush story. It was not just about gold. It was about what gold does to the people who find it, to the communities that grow around it, and to the workers who spend their lungs and their years pulling it out of the earth for someone else's benefit. It is a story about American capitalism at its most unrestrained, about what happens when there are no rules, no limits, and absolutely no accountability. The Pikes Peak region of Colorado was not, in the middle of the 19th century, unexplored territory. It had been prospected, assessed, and largely dismissed by several generations of miners and geologists who came looking for gold and left satisfied there was none worth finding. The first major rush came in 1859. The cry of Pikes Peak or bust sent approximately 100,000 people west from the Missouri River in a single season, the fastest mass migration in American history up to that point. Most went bust. The placer gold that had launched the rumor was real but thin. Most of the 100,000 turned around and went home, many pausing to scratch the bitter amendment and bust onto their wagon covers. The country around what would become Cripple Creek was considered particularly hopeless. It sat in a high basin on the southwestern flank of Pikes Peak, enclosed by hills that geologists identified as ancient volcanic formations. Volcanic country was bad country for gold. Everyone in the mining world agreed on this. Experienced prospectors passed through, noted the geology, and moved on. For 30 years, the basin was cattle country. One rancher knew it better than anyone. His name was Bob Womack. Womack was born in Kentucky in 1843, came to Colorado with the family cattle business, and spent years working ranches in the Cripple Creek Basin. He was not a trained geologist. He was not an experienced miner. What he was, by every account, was a man who noticed things: the color of rock, the texture of soil, the way certain outcroppings caught the light differently than the surrounding country. He started finding traces of gold in the late 1870s. Small traces, float gold, loose particles carried by water from some unknown primary formation. Enough to make him believe, not enough to convince anyone else. His neighbors regarded him with a mixture of affection and mild concern. People reserve for a good man with an unfortunate obsession. The geological experts confirmed the skepticism. The volcanic formations of the basin simply did not host gold deposits. That was settled science. Womack kept looking anyway. For more than a decade, he kept looking, at considerable personal cost. and when his obsession failed to produce results, which was most of the time, he drank the drinking matters, because in October 1890, Womack found what he had been looking for, a vein of gold-bearing rock on the slopes of a hill he called Poverty Gulch. He staked a claim, the El Paso Lode, and began trying to interest investors. Nobody believed him. The Colorado mining community had been burned by false Cripple Creek reports before. Womack spent months showing the ore, showing the claim, and being met with polite dismissal. What changed everything was not Womack's persuasiveness. It was the arrival, in early 1891, of a Colorado Springs carpenter named Winfield Scott Stratton, a methodical, technically educated man who had been prospecting the mountains for 18 years without success. When Stratton examined the Cripple Creek geology, he saw what the skeptics had missed. The volcanic formations were not standard volcanic rock. They were a diatreme, a specific pipe structure that could, under the right conditions, concentrate gold in extraordinary quantities. The conventional wisdom was simply wrong. Stratton staked his claim on July 4, 1891. He named it the Independence. It made him the wealthiest man in Colorado. Bob Womack sold the El Paso Lode for $500. He spent much of it on whiskey. He died in poverty in 1909, with almost nothing to show for the decade he had spent finding the richest gold district in the Western Hemisphere. His story is the oldest story in the mining West, almost too familiar to shock, almost. The summer of 1891 was when the world found out about Cripple Creek, and the world's response was immediate. News spread through the Colorado mining community first, then through the national press, then through the informal networks of experienced miners and speculators who were always listening for the next strike. Men came from Leadville, from Aspen, from Telluride, the great silver districts where the boom of the 1880s was already fading. They came from Denver, from Colorado Springs, from the eastern states, from California, from everywhere that a man with a pick and an ambition and not much else could be found. What they arrived to was a landscape in rapid, chaotic transformation. The basin sat above 9,500 feet. The air was thin. Winters arrived early and hit hard. The nearest railhead was miles away, which meant everything – food, lumber, equipment, blasting powder – came in by wagon at considerable cost. None of this slowed anybody down. By the end of 1891, several hundred miners were working claims. By the end of 1892, thousands. Tents gave way to board structures. Board structures gave way to proper buildings. Saloons appeared first, as they always did. Then hardware stores, assay offices, boarding houses, and banks. The gold was not the kind you panned from a stream. Cripple Creek was hard rock from the beginning. The gold locked in quartz and volcanic rock underground, requiring shaft sinking, drilling, and blasting to reach. This meant the individual prospector with a pan and a donkey was not the primary player for long. Hard rock mining required capital for shafts, timbers, equipment that the individual miner did not have. The district consolidated fast. By 1893, the most promising properties were already structured as corporations backed by outside investors. By 1900, Cripple Creek was effectively an industrial operation, worked by a labor force numbering in the thousands. But in the early window, before the consolidation, there was genuine democratic opportunity. A man who arrived early and staked the right ground could make a fortune. Several did, and no story defined the mythology of Cripple Creek more completely than Winfield Scott Stratton. Stratton came to Colorado Springs in 1872 as a carpenter from Indiana. He was skilled, methodical, and comfortable. Not wealthy, but he had been bitten by the prospecting obsession and could not shake it. For 18 years, he spent every available hour in the mountains, educating himself systematically in geology and mineralogy, searching without significant result. 18 years. Most men would have quit after 2. He arrived in the Cripple Creek Basin in the spring of 1891, assessed the geology with the practiced eye of a man who had spent nearly 2 decades studying mountain rock, and staked his claim on July 4th. He named it the Independence. He worked it himself through that summer, following the ore downward with the patience that had defined his entire searching life. What he found was extraordinary. Gold in concentrations that represented, by any standard, a major discovery. The Independence produced approximately $28 million over its working life. Stratton sold it in 1899 to a British syndicate for $11 million cash, the largest single mining transaction in Colorado history at that point. When he died in 1902, his estate was worth approximately $10 million. He left most of it to fund a home for the elderly poor in Colorado Springs. The Myron Stratton home still operates today, over a century later, built entirely on Cripple Creek gold. For every Stratton, though, there were 100 men who found something smaller, or nothing at all, or found a great deal and lost it to bad partners or bad luck. The mythology was built on Stratton. The reality was built on a much wider and considerably less spectacular distribution of outcomes. Then came 1893, and something that changed the district's trajectory in ways that would echo for decades. The United States government repealed the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, the federal legislation that had been propping up silver prices and sustaining Colorado's silver mining economy. The repeal was immediate and devastating. Silver prices collapsed. Leadville and Aspen went into sharp decline. Mines closed. Thousands of experienced workers were suddenly unemployed. Cripple Creek, running on gold rather than silver, was insulated. More than insulated, it became a magnet. The experienced miners pouring out of dying silver districts needed work, and the Cripple Creek mines needed exactly what those miners had. The collapse of the rest of Colorado's mining industry fed the boom that would make Cripple Creek the greatest gold district in the hemisphere. The infrastructure was going in. The capital was flowing. The ore was coming out in quantities that nobody had dreamed of when the basin was still cattle country. And the men doing the work were beginning, slowly and with gathering certainty, to understand their own collective power. That understanding would eventually produce a war. By 1895, Cripple Creek had ceased to be a mining camp and had become, by any reasonable definition, a city. The distinction matters. A mining camp is temporary by design, a collection of structures and services organized around the extraction of a finite resource, with no pretense of permanence. A city is something else entirely. A city has the architecture of permanence, the institutions of permanence, the social complexity of a community that expects to be there for generations. Cripple Creek, in the middle years of the 1890s, was building itself as a city, not as a camp that expected to empty when the gold ran out, but as a place that expected to grow and endure and become something lasting. The physical growth was staggering in its speed. In 1891, there had been nothing the valley but Womack's ranch and a few rough prospectors' camps. By 1893, there was a town site with several hundred buildings. By 1895, there were thousands. By 1900, the district as a whole, encompassing Cripple Creek proper and the surrounding communities of Victor, Goldfield, Anaconda, and several smaller camps, held somewhere between 40 and 50,000 people, making it the 4th largest city in Colorado and one of the largest gold mining communities in the world. The two great fires of 1896 punctuate this growth story in a way worth examining, because they reveal both the fragility and the resilience of what was being built. In April 1896, a fire broke out in a dance hall on Myers Avenue, the street that housed Cripple Creek's red light district, a collection of parlor houses, gambling saloons, and variety theaters that operated with the cheerful openness that characterized frontier communities before the forces of moral reform had fully organized. The April fire burned through several blocks of the downtown before being contained, destroying perhaps 200 structures. The community's response was immediate and determined. Rebuilding began within days. 3 days after the first fire was finally controlled, a second fire broke out. This one was far worse. Driven by wind and fed by the wooden construction that had replaced the first fire's ruins, the second blaze burned through the heart of the city with a thoroughness that left almost nothing standing in a significant portion of the commercial district. Thousands of people lost everything. The loss in property was estimated at $3 million, which in 1896 dollars represented a staggering sum. And then something happened that is, in its way, the most revealing moment in Cripple Creek's history, more revealing of the city's character and resource than any gold discovery. Within 48 hours of the second fire, construction crews were already at work. Within weeks, the wooden buildings that had burned were being replaced with brick, not rebuilt as they had been, rebuilt better. The gold was still in the ground, the money was still coming in, and the people who had built this city once decided, without apparent hesitation, to build it again. The Cripple Creek that emerged from the fires of 1896 was a different kind of place from the mining camp that had preceded it. The new downtown was built of brick, with the architectural ambition of a city that took itself seriously. Banks with granite facades, hotels with steam heat and electric lights, a city hall, churches, several of them. In the competitive denominational style of the era, a mining exchange modeled on the commodity exchanges of the major cities where shares in mining companies were traded daily. The Bennett Avenue Commercial District, which formed the central spine of the rebuilt city, was as well equipped as the commercial center of a Colorado city 3 times the size. The cultural infrastructure matched the physical ambition. The Cripple Creek Opera House, rebuilt after the fires in a form grander than its predecessor, was booking national touring companies. Emma Abbott sang there. Sarah Bernhardt, on her 1905 American tour, performed in Victor, the district's second major city. The district supported several newspapers, including the Cripple Creek Times and the Victor Daily Record, each with the combination of vigorous editorial opinion and thorough local coverage that characterized serious journalism of the era. The social world of Cripple Creek was, like every mining community's social world, sharply stratified, but in ways that were somewhat specific to this particular place and time. At the top were the mine owners and the major investors, a group that included several genuine millionaires and a much larger number of people who were comfortably wealthy by any standard. This upper layer lived in houses on the hills above the commercial district, attended the same churches and clubs, and formed the social and political leadership of the community. Below them, in terms of wealth but not necessarily in terms of social complexity, was a middle layer of mine managers, businessmen, lawyers, doctors, newspaper editors, and the various professionals and tradespeople who provided services to a city of 50,000. This group was not negligible. It represented the institutional backbone of the city, the people who maintained its courts and banks and schools and professional services. And then there were the miners, the men who went underground every day and did actual work that all the wealth rested on. They were the largest single group in the city's population. The district's mines employed thousands of men directly, and thousands more worked in related industries: smelting, transportation, supply. The miners were not by any means a homogeneous group. They ranged from the skilled, experienced hard rock miners who commanded premium wages for their expertise to the new arrivals from farming backgrounds or immigrant communities, who took the most dangerous, least skilled work at the minimum rates. They included Irish Americans, Cornish miners called Kuzan Jacks throughout the Western mining world, Italians, Slavs, and a substantial number of men from the South and Midwest who had come west, chasing the same dreams that had driven every gold rush since 1849. What united them, across all these differences of background and skill level, was the daily experience of underground work at high altitude. Work that was, in any honest accounting, extraordinarily hazardous. The mines of the Cripple Creek district operated at depths of hundreds, eventually thousands, of feet below the surface. The temperatures underground bore no relationship to the surface conditions. In the deep mines, the rock walls sweated with heat from geothermal sources, even as the winter air above was sub-zero. The dust from drilling operations carried silica particles that lodged in the lungs and produced a condition called miner's consumption, what would later be recognized as silicosis, that was endemic in the district and that shortened the lives of men who worked underground with a grim regularity. The mining methods of the era were also dangerous in more immediate ways. Blasting with black powder and, increasingly, dynamite was a routine part of underground work, and accidents were frequent. Falls of ground, the collapse of the rock overhead, were a constant hazard that mine managers tried to control through timbering, but could never entirely eliminate. The hoisting systems that brought men and ore to the surface were subject to cable failures and equipment malfunctions that could be instantly fatal. A shift underground in a Cripple Creek mine in 1897 was an exercise in the management of multiple simultaneous Hazardsby men who were paid $3 a day. $3 a day, it should be said, was not bad pay for the 1890s. It was, for skilled work, a respectable working-class wage. A miner who worked consistently could support a family, rent a house, and participate in the commercial life of the city. The standard of living in Cripple Creek for the employed miner was not significantly worse than the standard in most American industrial cities of the period. But the miners understood something about their situation that the comfortable arithmetic of daily wages obscured. Their labor was the source of every dollar of the district's extraordinary wealth, and their share of that wealth was fixed at $3 a day, regardless of how much gold was being pulled from the ground. In a year when the Portland mine produced $3 million in gold, the men who dug that gold out of the rock received $3 a shift. The relationship between what they produced and what they received was, as labor movement organizers would point out with increasing effectiveness, fundamentally and deliberately inequitable. The organizational response to this inequity was already taking shape before their city's greatest years had arrived. The Western Federation of Miners had been chartered in Butte, Montana in 1893, in the immediate aftermath of the silver collapse that had devastated the rest of Colorado's mining communities. It was organized specifically to address the conditions of hard rock miners in the Mountain West. The wages, the hours, the safety conditions. and the broader relationship between labor and capital in an industry that was both enormously productive and extraordinarily indifferent to the welfare of the people doing the physical work. The WFM came to Cripple Creek in 1894. Its arrival would set in motion a conflict that would define and ultimately destroy the greatest gold city in American history. The men who owned the Cripple Creek mines were not, for the most part, the kind of people that the mythology of the American West celebrates. They were not frontiersmen or cowboys or rugged individualists of the heroic type. They were businessmen, sharp, aggressive, well-connected businessmen who had understood before most people that Cripple Creek's gold required not just discovery but organization, capital, and the kind of political relationships that translated wealth into power. The most important figure in this world, the man whose decisions did more than any other single individual to shape the district's history, was not a mine owner at all. He was a lawyer and political operative named James H. Peabody, who would eventually become governor of Colorado. But before Peabody, we need to understand the mine owners themselves, because it was the mine owners' decisions, their determination to break the labor movement at any cost, that created the conditions for the violence that followed. The ownership of the major Cripple Creek mines by the late 1890s had consolidated significantly from the dispersed prospector ownership of the early rush. The largest operations were controlled by a relatively small number of individuals and syndicates who had the capital to develop deep mines and the political connections to navigate the legal and regulatory landscape of Colorado's mining industry. Winfield Scott Stratton was the most prominent of the individual owners, but Stratton was, in important ways, atypical. He was genuinely wealthy, the richest man in Colorado, but he maintained a complex, ambivalent relationship with the labor question that set him apart from the more aggressive members of his class. He had worked as a laboring man himself for 20 years. He remembered what it was. And though he was no labor radical, he was also not a bitter opponent of union organization in the way that many of his peers were. The mine owners who drove the district's politics in a different direction, weremen like David Moffett, the Denver banker and railroad promoter who had significant interests in several major mines, Eben Smith, the veteran Colorado mining man who became a central figure in the mine owners' organization, and a rotating cast of investors and managers connected to the major capitalized operations. What united these men, beyond their economic interests, was a worldview about the proper relationship between capital and labor that was, in the America of 1900, not unusual among their class, but was, in its Colorado mountain form, expressed with particular clarity and force. Capital, in this view, took the risk. Capital made the investment. Capital built the infrastructure. Labor was a commodity, a necessary input into the production process, to be acquired at the market rate like any other input. The idea that labor had an inherent right to organize, to collectively bargain, to determine its own conditions of work, was not just economically threatening to these men. It was philosophically objectionable. It violated their understanding of how a free market economy properly worked. This worldview was not cynical posturing. These men genuinely believed it, and it put them on a collision course with the Western Federation of Miners that was, given the convictions on both sides, essentially inevitable. The WFM had established Local 19 in Cripple Creek in 1894. Its initial organizing efforts were met with the standard responses of the era. Some employers fired union members. Others declined to recognize the union's right to represent their workers, and the union responded with strikes and job actions. The first major strike in the district's history came in early 1894, just as the rush was accelerating into its first major phase. The issues in the 1894 strike were, by the standards of what would come later, relatively modest. The union was demanding maintenance of the $3 daily wage and the 8-hour shift. The mine owners, facing the first significant downturn in gold prices, wanted to cut wages and extend the shift to 10 hours. It was a recognizable industrial dispute, the kind that was being played out in mining districts and factory towns across America in the 1890s. What made the 1894 Cripple Creek strike unusual, and what established the template for everything that followed, was the response of the Colorado state government. Governor Davis Waite, a populist who had been elected on a reform platform, sided with the miners. When the mine owners brought in a private militia force, hired gunmen organized as a sheriff's posse, to intimidate striking miners and protect replacement workers, Waite deployed the state militia. But he deployed them to protect the strikers, not to break the strike. The mine owners, facing a state militia that was not on their side, negotiated. The union won. The $3 wage and the 8-hour shift were maintained. The lesson the mine owners drew from 1894 was specific and consequential. WAFAD defeated them was not the miners' organization. It was the political accident of a reform governor. The real work after 1894 was to ensure that the political accident was not repeated, to build the kind of political connections and financial relationships that would ensure that when the next conflict came, and everyone on both sides understood there would be a next conflict, the state government would be on the owner's side. The vehicle for this political project was the Mine Owners Association, which reorganized and strengthened itself after the 1894 defeat. The MOA built systematic relationships with the Republican Party of Colorado, contributing to campaigns, cultivating candidates, and positioning itself to translate its financial resources in political influence. It was patient, methodical work, and it took nearly a decade to produce its intended result. But by 1902, when James Peabody won the Colorado governorship on the Republican ticket, the mine owners had their man in the State House. Meanwhile, on the other side of this building confrontation, the Western Federation of Miners was doing its own organizational work. The WFM of the late 1890s and early 1900s was, by any standard, one of the most militant labor organizations America. Its president, Edward Boyce, had been a veteran of the Kerr-Dalenemeening Wars in Idaho, where federal troops had been deployed to break a strike and miners had been imprisoned in bullpens, outdoor stockades, for months. Boyce and the WFM leadership had drawn from that experience a conclusion that was, in the context of the era, both radical and realistic, that the mine owners would use any means available to destroy the union, including state violence, and that the union needed to be prepared for a conflict that went beyond ordinary industrial relations. By 1900, the WFM had affiliated with socialist and labor reform movements at the national level and had established itself as the most significant labor organization, the Mountain West. In Cripple Creek, Local 19 had built a membership that encompassed a substantial majority of the district's underground miners. The union had a hall, a library, a sick benefit fund, and the organizational infrastructure of a serious institution. The two organizations, the Mine Owners Association and the Western Federation of Miners, were building toward a confrontation that, when it came, would be the most violent labor conflict in Colorado history and one of the most violent in American history. The gold that had built everything was still in the ground. The shafts were still producing. The city was still growing. But underneath the surface prosperity, both literally and figuratively, the forces that would destroy it were already fully assembled. One more figure deserves introduction in this context, because without him the story's violence would be incomplete. His name was Sherman Bell. He was a former Rough Rider, a veteran of Theodore Roosevelt's Cuba campaign in 1898, and would become the Adjutant General of Colorado's National Guard. Bell was a man of genuine physical courage and a complete absence of political nuance, who would look at a labor dispute in the Colorado mountains and see a military problem to be solved with military means. When he arrived in Cripple Creek in 1903, he brought with him the habits of mind of a man who had spent his formative military years in a war where the enemy was shot. He would apply those habits with a thoroughness that stunned even some of his supporters. The second great Cripple Creek strike began in August 1903. To understand why it began, and why it escalated into something far beyond a labor dispute, you need to understand what had been happening in the Colorado mining industry in the 3 years preceding it. The immediate trigger was not in Cripple Creek at all. It was in the ore processing mills of Colorado City, a small city near Colorado Springs, where the ore from the Cripple Creek mines was sent to be refined. The mill workers of Colorado City had organized under the WFM and had struck in early 1903, demanding union recognition and improved conditions. The mine owners of the Cripple Creek district responded by refusing to honor the strike. They continued sending ore to the mills, where replacement workers processed it while the strikers picketed outside. The Cripple Creek miners, in an act of labor solidarity that was also a demonstration of organizational discipline, voted to strike in sympathy with the Colorado City mill workers. This was not a decision taken lightly. The Cripple Creek miners were in a strong position. The mines were producing well, wages were being paid, and the immediate conditions underground were no worse than they had been. The strike was a choice to sacrifice their own economic security in support of workers in a different industry, in a different city, over issues that did not directly affect them. It was a choice that reflected both the genuine solidarity culture of the WFMAND, a strategic understanding of labor power that was, for 1903, sophisticated. If the mill workers could be broken, if the mine owners could successfully introduce non-union labor into the mills, then the organizational gains of the previous decade were vulnerable. The integrity of the union movement in Colorado required defending the mill workers, even at the cost of a fight that the miners had not chosen. The mine owners received the strike with what can only be described as satisfaction. They had been preparing for this moment for nearly a decade, since the embarrassment of 1894. The Mine Owners Association had the organizational structure, the financial reserves, and the political relationships to respond at scale. And now they had, in Governor James Peabody, the political ally they had been cultivating. Peabody declared a state of insurrection in the Cripple Creek district in November 1903, providing the legal basis for the deployment of the Colorado National Guard. The declaration was constitutionally dubious. There was no actual insurrection, in any ordinary meaning of the term, occurring in the district, but it served its purpose. It gave the Guard its deployment authority, and it gave Adjutant General Sherman Bell his command. Bell arrived in the district with approximately 1,000 National Guard troops and an approach to labor relations that was, to say the least, uncomplicated. He declared martial law, an authority that legal scholars then and since have questioned. He actually possessed and began enforcing it with the certainty of a man who had never found complexity useful. The first major action under Bell's authority was the establishment of what was called a military zone around the mines. Within this zone, Bell claimed the authority to arrest anyone at will, without warrant, without charges, and without any of the other procedural requirements that American law normally imposed on detention. He exercised this authority immediately and extensively. Union officers, strike leaders, newspaper editors who had written critically of the military presence, all were subject to arrest and detention in the military bullpen that Bell established at the Goldfield camp. The bullpen was a deliberate echo of the Coeur d'Alene bullpens that WFM leaders like the newly elected President Charles Moyer remembered from 1892. It was a collection of fenced enclosures, open to the weather, in which arrested men were held without heat, without adequate food, and without access to legal counsel. Lawyers who attempted to serve habeas corpus writs on Bell were arrested themselves. A federal judge who issued such a writ found it simply ignored. Bell's responsetto legal challenges was a phrase that became notorious in the subsequent investigations of the conflict. Habeas corpus be damned, we'll give them post-mortem corpus. The statement was a joke of sorts. Bell was not without a dark humor, but it reflected a genuine and chilling reality. The civil law had been suspended in the Cripple Creek district. The constitutional protections that American citizens were supposed to enjoy against arbitrary arrest, against detention without charge, against military jurisdiction in civilian contexts, had been set aside by a National Guard adjutant general acting on the authority of a governor who had been elected with the financial support of the men whose labor dispute he was now resolving by force. The national press, for the most part, paid limited attention. The Western Federation of Miners was, in the national press of 1903, not a sympathetic organization. Its socialism, its radicalism, its association with figures like Big Bill Haywood, who was already being portrayed as a dangerous revolutionary, made it easy for editors in the East to frame the Cripple Creek conflict as a matter of law enforcement, rather than labor rights. The mine owners were efficient publicists. Their narrative, that the WFM was a violent criminal organization that had to be suppressed for the safety of the community, had the advantage of simplicity and the backing of substantial advertising revenue. The miners' narrative, that they were American citizens being held in outdoor prisons by a military force deployed on behalf of private financial interests, without legal basis and without constitutional authority, was more complicated, less comfortable, and less well-funded. William Haywood, who was already becoming the most prominent spokesman for the Western mining labor movement, came to Cripple Creek in late 1903 and observed the situation with the combination of outrage and strategic intelligence that characterized his best work. He documented the bullpen conditions. He organized the communication of the miners' perspective to sympathetic newspapers and labor publications. He coordinated the legal challenges that Bell and Peabody were brushing aside with such casual contempt. And he was losing, not because his cause was unjust, but because the other side had the National Guard, side the mining communities. The human cost of the military occupation was becoming visible in ways that statistics could not capture. Families whose wage earner had been arrested and thrown in the bullpen had no income. The union's relief fund, which had been organized to support striking miners, was being stretched to its limits by both the duration of the strike and the extraordinary demands created by the military occupation. Merchants who had extended credito miners were discovering that credit could not be repaid when the miners were behind wire. The economic damage was radiating outward from the immediate dispute into the broader commercial fabric of the city. Meanwhile, the mine owners were importing replacement workers, scabs, in the language of the labor movement, free labor, in the language of the owners, to replace the striking miners. The replacement workers were, in many cases, men who had no connection to Colorado and no history with the district, recruited from as far away as the South and the Midwest, with promises of wages that exceeded what the striking miners had been receiving. Some were unaware that they were being brought in to replace strikers. Others were aware and did not care. The stage was set for the escalation that would transform a labor dispute into something closer to a civil war. Violence had been present in the Cripple Creek labor conflict from its early days. The arrests, the bullpen, the armed guard patrols were themselves forms of organized violence, directed by the state on behalf of the mine owners. But in the summer of 1904, the character of the conflict changed. It became lethal in a new and more direct way, and the consequences of that lethality would determine the district's fate. The critical event was the Independence Depot explosion of June 6, 1904. The Independence Depot was a wooden platform structure at the mine of the Salmonaim, the great mine that Winfield Scott Stratton had built on his independence claim, which had since been sold to a British syndicate and was now one of the largest producing operations in the district. At approximately 2:15 in the morning of June 6th, a massive explosion destroyed the depot platform at the moment when a shift of non-union replacement workers was assembling to board the train that would take them home. 13 men died, many more were injured. The explosion had been caused by a bomb placed beneath the platform structure, a bomb of considerable sophistication, using a timing mechanism. The Mine Owners Association and the Citizens Alliance, a business organization that had been formed specifically to support the mine owners in the conflict, immediately attributed the explosion to the Western Federation of Miners. Their case rested primarily on the logic of motivation. Who would benefit from an attack on non-union workers, if not the union? Physical evidence connecting specific individuals to the bombing was limited, and the subsequent legal proceedings were complicated. But in the atmosphere of 1904, in a district under martial law with a military apparatus that had already demonstrated its willingness to act outside legal constraints, the evidentiary standards of a court of law were somewhat beside the point. Sherman Bell and the National Guard responded to the Independence Depot explosion with a ferocity that went beyond anything that had preceded it. Within hours of the explosion, the military was conducting arrests across the district on a scale that amounted to a roundup. Union officers, strike activists, anyone who had been prominently identified with the labor movement was arrested. The bullpen was filled beyond its capacity. The Citizens Alliance, a vigilante organization in everything but name, organized its own response alongside the military's. Alliance members, many of them armed, conducted their own raids, arrests, and assaults on Union members and labor supporters. The line between official military authority and vigilante action became, in the days following the explosion, essentially indistinguishable. Both wore the same political colors. Both operated toward the same end. It is worth pausing on the Independence Depot explosion itself, because the question of who actually planted the bomb has been a matter of historical dispute for more than a century. The WFM denied responsibility. Contemporary investigations produced conflicting evidence. Subsequent historical analysis has suggested possibilities, including agent provocateur activity. The possibility that the bombing was carried out by individuals connected to the mine owner's side to provide the justification for the full-scale military crackdown that followed. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, which was working for the mine owners in this period, had a history of such operations in labor conflicts elsewhere. The truth of who planted the bomb may never be definitively established. What can be established is that the explosion provided the pretext for an escalation, that the mine owners and the state military apparatus were prepared to undertake, and that the escalation proceeded with a speed and thoroughness that suggested it had been planned and held in readiness. The violence did not flow only in one direction. The labor conflict in the Cripple Creek district produced acts of violence by miners and union members that were real, documented, and serious. Assaults on replacement workers, sabotage of mine equipment, intimidation of men who continued to work. These were features of the conflict, not inventions of mine owner propaganda. The WFM, for all its eloquent advocacy of labor rights, was also an organization operating in that tradition of industrial conflict in which violence was an accepted tool of both sides. The moral symmetry of the conflict, in which neither side had entirely clean hands, was real. What was not symmetrical was power. The mine owners had the National Guard, the governor's office, the state legal apparatus, the financial resources to sustain a prolonged conflict, and the press. The miners had their organization, their solidarity, and the law as it was supposed to work, which turned out to worth considerably less than the law as it was being applied. One figure who captures the character of the conflict's violence with particular clarity is Harry Orchard. Orchard, real name Albert Horsley, was a man with a complicated history in the mining West, including time in the Cripple Creek district, who would later confess to a series of bombings and assassinations connected to the labor wars of this period. His confessions, obtained under circumstances that labor supporters argued were coerced, implicated WFM leadership, including Bill Haywood, in a conspiracy of violence that became the basis for one of the most famous trials in American legal history. The full story of Harry Orchard, Bill Haywood, and the subsequent murder trial of 1907 in Boise, Idaho, belongs to a different chapter of this history. Haywood was acquitted, famously defended by Clarence Darrow, but its roots were planted in the Cripple Creek violence of 1903 and 1904, the underground dimensions of the conflict, the world of the mines themselves, had their own specific character of violence that is sometimes lost in the larger political narrative. Mine managers who enforced the replacement of union workers were targeted. Mine property was sabotaged. On at least one occasion, a mine was flooded deliberately. On another, hoisting cable was tampered with in a way that could have caused deaths. These acts, which the union denied authorizing even when their perpetrators were clearly labor sympathizers, gave the mine owners genuine grounds for the claim that the conflict had moved beyond labor dispute into criminal territory. But the response to this criminal activity, if it was criminal, which some of it certainly was not the deployment of law enforcement and the prosecution of individual offenders. It was martial law, mass detention, and what would eventually become mass deportation. The mine owners were not interested in prosecuting individual criminals. They were interested in destroying the Western Federation of Miners as an organization in the Cripple Creek district. The Independence Depot explosion gave them the pretext. The National Guard gave them the means. And what happened next was something that had no precedent in American labor history. In the weeks immediately following the Independence Depot explosion of June 1904, the Cripple Creek district was governed by a kind of authority that had no formal name, but that everyone living under it understood perfectly. It was not military law in the constitutional sense, because the Colorado Supreme Court's eventual validation of Peabody's actions was a political decision dressed in legal language, and everyone in the district who had any familiarity with the actual text of the Constitution knew it. It was not civil law, because the civil courts were effectively suspended, the writs they issued were being ignored, and the lawyers who attempted to practice in them were subject to arrest. It was something in between. A regime of organized force, temporarily legitimized by the emergency declaration and the compliance of the courts, that derived its authority from the willingness and ability of Sherman Bell and his National Guard forces to use it. The men and women living in the district under this regime experienced it in specific, daily, material ways that the abstractions of constitutional law cannot capture. A miner walking to work in the morning might be stopped and questioned by a National Guard patrol. A meeting of more than a few people in a private home might draw the attention of the Citizens Alliance, whose informants were active throughout the community. A newspaper editor who wrote critically of the military occupation, and several did, at considerable personal risk, could find his premises raided and his equipment seized. The atmosphere of surveillance and intimidation was, in the accounts of those who lived through it, both oppressive and strangely numbing. The human capacity to adapt to abnormal conditions is remarkable, and the people of Cripple Creek, those who stayed, who were not deported, who were not imprisoned, developed the adaptive responses of people living under arbitrary authority, the careful self-censorship, the calculation of what could be said to whom, the performance of normality as a survival strategy. Children went to school. Businesses opened, the mines ran. The replacement, workers who had been brought in to work them doing their shifts under the protection of the armed guard, watched by the exhausted remnants of the striking miners who were still present in the community. Life continued in the forms that life takes when it has no alternative. But something was different, something that the population of the district could feel but not quite articulate. A quality of permanent precariousness had entered the community's self-understanding. The knowledge, now visceral rather than abstract, that the protections they had believed they had as American citizens could be suspended at the discretion of a governor, whose election had been funded by the men who employed them. That knowledge does not leave a community easily. It shapes how people think about their futures, about investment, about whether to stay or go. And in 1904, in Cripple Creek, the knowledge was very fresh. The deportations of 1904 are, by any objective measure, one of the most extraordinary violations of American civil liberties ever carried out on American soil in peacetime. They are not widely known outside of labor history circles. They should be required reading in every American history classroom. Beginning in June 1904, in the weeks immediately following the Independence Depot explosion, the National Guard and Citizens Alliance vigilantes began systematically removing men from the Cripple Creek district by force, not to prison, though some were imprisoned, out of the state entirely. Estimates range from 150 to several hundred men who were loaded onto trains or wagons under armed guard and deposited in Kansas, in New Mexico, at the borders of Colorado, and told with complete directness that if they returned, they would be shot. The mechanism was not spontaneous. It was organized and methodical in a way that reflected planning rather than reaction. Lists of union members and labor activists had been maintained for months, possibly years, by the Mine Owners Association and the Citizens Alliance. Those lists became the targeting document. Men were arrested at their homes, at their workplaces, walking on the street. They were given no hearings, no charges, no opportunity to speak. In many cases, their families were not told where they were being taken. In some cases, wives who attempted to follow were threatened themselves. The trains carrying the deportees ran under National Guard escort to the Colorado state line. At the border, the escort stopped. The men were removed from the cars, in some documented accounts, removed from boxcars of the kind typically used for cattle in summer heat without adequate water, and left. Some had money, many did not. Some made their way to the nearest town, sent word to their families, and eventually rebuilt whatever life was available to them outside Colorado. Others disappeared into the economic margins of the country permanently. One group was deposited miles from the nearest settlement on the Kansas plains. The commanding officer, by multiple accounts, delivered a brief speech before leaving them there. He told them this was what happened to men who violated the law. None of them had been charged with any specific violation. None had been tried. None had been convicted of anything. Charles Moyer, the president of the Western Federation of Miners, was arrested and held in the bullpen for months, without a single charge filed against him. Every habeas corpus petition his lawyers filed was rejected or ignored. When he was eventually released, it was not because any court ordered it. It was because the mine owners had decided his continued detention was no longer useful. The legal architecture supporting all of this was, to put it plainly, invented. The Colorado Supreme Court upheld Peabody's martial law declaration in a decision that required treating the governor's emergency powers as essentially unlimited within the declared zone. A zone that happened to coincide precisely with the geography of the labor dispute. Federal courts were more skeptical, but their involvement came too late and achieved too little. The deportations had already happened. The men were already gone. The union was already broken. Here's the thing that the mine owners understood, and the miners did not fully, not until it was too late. The legal challenges, the habeas corpus writs, the federal court petitions, the constitutional arguments were real. They were correct. They would, in a functioning legal system, have prevailed. But the legal system in Teller County, Colorado, in the summer of 1904, was not fully functioning. It was operating under the supervision of a National Guard adjutant general who had publicly announced that habeas corpus was, in his district, inoperative. Sherman Bell's famous line, "Habeas corpus be damned, we'll give them post-mortem corpus," was delivered as dark humor. It landed as policy. The Mine Owners Association declared victory immediately after the deportations. They had achieved precisely what they had organized, funded, and politically engineered across a decade to achieve. The Western Federation of Miners Local 19 was destroyed as a functioning organization in the Cripple Creek district. The men who had led it were in exile, in prison, or in hiding. The replacement workers now running the mines were non-union, unorganized, and working for wages set entirely by the owners with no mechanism for collective challenge. What the owners did not calculate, what their victory accounting did not include, was the cost to the district of destroying its own human infrastructure. The experienced miners who were deported or fled were not interchangeable industrial workers. They were specialists. The geology of the Cripple Creek mines was specific, complex, and deeply familiar to the men who had worked it for a decade. They knew which ground was safe and which was not. They knew the quirks of specific shafts. They knew the ore. Replacing them with men recruited from outside Colorado who had no knowledge of this particular underground world reduced the efficiency of the mines in ways that were not immediately visible in the production statistics, but that accumulated year by year into a measurable and irreversible decline. The community cost was harder to quantify, but equally real. The social confidence that had carried Cripple Creek through 2 catastrophic fires, through the silver crash, through the technical challenges of deep hard rock mining at high altitude. That confidence had been built partly on the shared understanding that this was a place where people could build lives. The deportations shattered that understanding. The message they delivered was specific and devastating. This is a place where the government will load you into a cattle car if the men who own the mines decide you have become inconvenient. That message does not leave a community quickly. It shapes how people think about their futures, whether to invest, whether to stay, whether to bring a family here or somewhere else. In 1904, the ore was still in the ground. The mines were still running. The brick buildings of Bennett Avenue were still standing. By every visible measure, Cripple Creek was still a city. But the thing that makes a city, the collective belief that it has a future worth building, had been deliberately broken by the men who owned it. The decade between 1905 and 1915 was Cripple Creek's long exhalation. The period when the district remained outwardly functional, while everything beneath the surface was moving in one direction. Gold production stayed substantial in the immediate post-Labor War years. The mines were still working. The railroads were still running. Bennett Avenue still had its banks and its merchants and the surface appearance of a commercial district. A visitor arriving in 1907 without context could have looked at the physical city and concluded that its decline was not inevitable. That conclusion would have been wrong. But you had to know what to look for. And the people who had been there longest, the merchants who had been extending credit since the 1890s, the physicians who had watched the patient load in the mining hospitals, the newspaper editors who tracked the flow of legal notices and business registrations. They knew, they could see it in the small things before the large things became undeniable. The boarding houses that were 3/4 full instead of packed. The assay offices that were processing less ore per week than they had 2 years prior. The families leaving on the morning train with more luggage than anyone making a short trip would need. The gradual thinning of the district's human density, barely perceptible week to week, unmistakable across a year. The first structural problem was geological, and it was operating independently of everything the mine owners and the WFM had done to each other. The Cripple Creek deposit, like most gold deposits, showed declining ore grades as mining extended to greater depths. The upper levels had been extraordinarily rich, ore running hundreds of dollars per ton at the prices of the era, in concentrations that made the early mines almost effortlessly profitable. As the shafts went deeper through the first decade of the 20th century, the grade declined. Not catastrophically, not all at once, but measurably consistently year by year. The mines required more work, more capital, and more careful management to produce the same return that shallower workings had yielded in the district's prime years. The combination of declining ore grades and the loss of the skilled labor force created a squeeze that the district's operators managed, but but never resolved. You needed higher efficiency to make lower grade ore pay. You had lower efficiency because the experienced workers who had been the foundation of that efficiency were gone. The arithmetic was not favorable, and it became less favorable with each year that passed. What this meant in practical terms for the men running the mines was a constant pressure to reduce operating costs that had no clean solution. You could reduce wages, and the mine owners did, gradually in the years after 1904, exploiting the absence of union organization to push the daily rate below the $3 that had been the standard of the golden era. You could reduce safety expenditures, and this happened too, quietly, in the decisions made by shift bosses and mine managers who were accountable to distant investors, more interested in production figures than in the condition of the timbering. You could push men harder and longer for the same pay, and this happened as well. None of it was enough to reverse the fundamental geological reality. The grade was going down. The costs of deep mining were going up. The margin between the two was narrowing year by year toward a point where it would disappear entirely. The year 1913 brought another layer of difficulty that compounded the geological problem with a new financial one. The federal income tax, established by the 16th Amendment, changed the economics of mining investment in ways that discouraged the capital commitments the district's deep mines increasingly required. Investors who had been willing to fund mine development at the margin found the calculation less attractive when a portion of any return would now go to the federal government. The flow of outside capital into the district, which had been essential to its development through the boom years, began to slow in ways that were immediately felt by the mine managers who needed that capital to maintain and deepen their operations. It is worth understanding what capital withdrawal actually meant for a deep hard rock mining operation in practical terms. The Cripple Creek mines by 1913 were working at depths of several hundred to over 1,000 feet below the surface. Maintaining a deep mine shaft is not a passive activity. The timbering that holds the walls and roof of the workings rots and must be replaced continuously. The pumps that keep the workings dry must run without interruption. A flooded shaft can become unworkable in a matter of weeks if the pumps stop. The hoisting equipment that brings men and ore to the surface wears and must be maintained and periodically replaced. Every one of these maintenance activities requires capital. When the capital flow slows, the maintenance falls behind. When maintenance falls behind, the mine deteriorates, and a deteriorating mine is, in the specific and literal sense, a dying mine. The operators who understood this, and the experienced ones did understand it clearly, were making a calculation in the years after 1913 that was as clear as it was grim. They could invest the capital to maintain and deepen their properties, accepting a marginal return on that investment given the declining ore grades, or they could reduce their maintenance expenditures, extract whatever value remained in the existing workings, and eventually walk away. More and more of them were choosing the latter path, not always consciously, not always as an explicit decision, but in the accumulation of deferred maintenance decisions, reduced capital budgets, and production plans that emphasized current extraction over long-term sustainability. The choice was being made. The First World War arrived in 1914 and took men. The draft and the pull of defense industry wages drew younger workers out of the district with a speed and completeness that the gradual demographic drain of the previous decade had not approached. The young men who left for the war or for the defense plants of Denver and Pueblo were the demographic that would, in an earlier era have been the next generation of skilled underground miners, the men who would have been learning the deep workings under the guidance of the experienced generation above them, building the specific technical knowledge that deep hard rock mining required. When they left, that generational transmission stopped. The war also disrupted the international capital markets that had periodically provided investment in Colorado mining properties. British capital, which had been a consistent and significant presence in the district since the early Rush years. The British syndicate that had bought Stratton's Independence Mine for $11 million in 1899 was only the most visible of many British investments in the district, effectively disappeared from American mining of the war and did not fully return afterward. The post-war British economy was not the economy that had been sending capital to Colorado in the 1890s and 1900s. The war had consumed too much of it. Prohibition reached Colorado in 1916, 3 years before the National Amendment forced the rest of the country to follow. The saloons closed. This sounds, viewed from a distance of a century, like a minor detail in a story of geological decline and labor conflict and wartime disruption. It was not a minor detail. The saloon in a mining community was not simply a place to drink. It was the social infrastructure of working-class male life in an era before television, before radio, before the digital connectivity that now substitutes for physical gathering. The saloon was the news exchange, where men learned what was happening in the district and the world beyond it. It was the informal credit market, where a miner could get a meal or a drink on account when his wages had not yet arrived. It was the meeting place where the organizational life of the community, including, critically, the organizational life of the labor movement, had historically taken root and grown. The elimination of the saloon did not simply remove a place to drink. It removed the connective tissue of the community's social life and replaced it with nothing adequate. The churches offered community to those inclined toward religion. The union halls, where they still existed, offered meeting space, but neither replicated the universal, daily, informal social function that the saloon had served. The men who remained in Cripple Creek after Prohibition found themselves in a community that was simultaneously smaller and less connected than it had been, a combination that accelerated the sense of decline even when the production statistics had not yet fully reflected it. The 1920s brought the national economic boom of the post-war decade to most of America. The decade of jazz and automobiles and rising stock prices and the confident expansion of American consumer culture barely touched Cripple Creek. The mines that were still operating were working marginal properties on thin margins. The major investors had mostly moved on, to the oil fields of Oklahoma and Texas, to the automobile industry of Michigan, to the real estate booms of Florida and California, where the post-war prosperity was concentrating. The population of the district had dropped from its 1900 peak of 50,000 to something closer to 5,000 by 1920, a 90% reduction in 2 decades. The buildings that 50,000 people had filled were now occupied by a tenth that number, giving the city the hollow, oversized quality of a suit made for a larger man. The physical evidence of the decline was everywhere for those who knew how to read it. Buildings that had been commercial establishments were now storage facilities or simply vacant. The mining exchange that had once processed thousands of trades daily had closed. The electric streetcar system that had connected the district's communities, one of the genuine markers of urban ambition at altitude, had suspended service and the tracks were being pulled up for the metal. The railroad companies that had competed so fiercely for the district's traffic in the 1890s were now quietly petitioning for permission to reduce service, then to abandon lines that no longer justified their operating costs. The human population that remained was aging. The young men had left. The families with options had left. What remained was a concentration of people whose lives were rooted in the district too deeply to be easily transplanted. Older miners who had built their world here. Merchants whose businesses were tied to the local economy. Families whose property and community connections made departure a cost they were not prepared to pay. They maintained the remaining institutions with the particular determination of people who have decided, consciously or not, that staying is itself a form of resistance to the forces pushing them out. Then, unexpectedly, came reprieve. Franklin Roosevelt's Gold Reserve Act of January 1934 reset the gold price from $20.67 per ounce, the fixed rate that had governed the district's economics for more than 3 decades, to $35 per ounce. The increase was nearly 70%. For Cripple Creek, sitting on reserves of lower-grade ore that had been economically inaccessible at the old price, this was a lifeline thrown from an entirely unexpected direction by a president whose primary concern was the broader collapse of the American banking system rather than the specific revival of a fading Colorado gold district. But the effect on Cripple Creek was immediate and genuine. Ore that had been sitting at the margins of economic viability at $20.67 was suddenly profitable at $35. Properties that had been operated on skeleton maintenance crews were reopened and restaffed. New investment entered the district for the first time in years. Cautious investment, modest in scale compared to the boom years, but real capital willing to fund real operations. Employment increased. Men who had left the district returned. For a few years in the mid-1930s, Cripple Creek had the feeling of a community that had been given a second chance. It is important to be precise about what this revival was and what it was not. It was real. Production figures increased. The population stabilized and ticked upward. The remaining businesses on Bennett Avenue saw improved trade. The newspapers that had been contracting in size and frequency began expanding again. The social life of the community, which had been reduced to a kind of maintenance mode, showed genuine signs of renewal. But it was a revival built on a price increase, not on a discovery. The gold being mined in the 1930s was lower-grade ore than the gold that had been mined in the 1890s and 1900s. The mines were working at greater depths, with higher costs, against a geological reality that had not changed. The skilled labor force that had been the human engine of the golden era was not rebuilt by a price increase. The men with the deep specific knowledge of the Cripple Creek underground world were mostly gone, dead, or too old to work underground. The infrastructure of the district, the shafts, the timbering, the hoisting equipment, reflected decades of deferred maintenance that could not be fully corrected in a few years of improved economics. What the 1930s revival actually was, in retrospect, was the district's last productive chapter, not its worst chapter. The labor wars had been far worse in human terms. Not its most desperate chapter. The years after the war would be more desperate. But its last chapter as a genuinely functioning gold mining district, doing the work it had been built to do, however reduced in scale and ambition, from the extraordinary years of its peak. The War Production Board's limitation order, L-208, issued in October 1942, ended that last chapter with bureaucratic finality. Gold was declared non-essential to the war effort. Gold mines across the United States were ordered to close. The Cripple Creek operations shut down. The pumps that had kept the deep workings dry for decades were turned off. Within weeks, the water that the pumps had been holding back began to rise. Within months, shafts that men had worked for 40 years were flooded to depths that would require extraordinary effort and expense to restore. The workers dispersed with the speed that wartime America demanded of its labor force. Some went to the defense plants of Denver and Pueblo, where the wages were better than anything the mines had been paying, and the work was at least above ground. Some were drafted, some were too old for either, and simply stayed in the district, watching the operations close around them. The community that had already been reduced to a fraction of its peak size contracted further as the wartime economy pulled away what remained of its working-age population. The end of the war in 1945 raised, briefly, the question of whether the Cripple Creek mining district might be restored to operation. The answer, when the calculations were actually done, was mostly no. Pumping the flooded shafts would require capital investment that the economics of gold mining at $35 per ounce. The price remained fixed at the 1934 level until 1971, could not justify except for the most optimistic projections of what the restored workings might contain. The physical infrastructure had deteriorated beyond easy repair. The institutional knowledge of the specific underground world of the Cripple Creek mines was critically thin. The men who had known those mines intimately, who had known which ground was safe and which was not, which veins ran true and which pinched out, which shafts had quirks that required specific handling, were mostly gone. A few properties tried to reopen. The Crescent Mine, one of the great producers of the early era, made the attempt. The Vindicator Mine, another storied property whose history stretched back to the first years of the rush, tried as well. A handful of smaller operations tested the economics of the restored price and the deteriorated infrastructure against each other and found the result discouraging. By the early 1950s, commercial gold mining in the Cripple Creek district had ceased as a significant economic enterprise. Not with a dramatic announcement, not with a ceremony or a formal closure. With the gradual stopping of the last pumps, the final sealing of the last shafts, the quiet dispersal of the last crews, the population count in 1960 was under 500. The city that had held 50,000 at the turn of the century. A city with 3 competing railroads, an opera house, an electric streetcar system, a financial exchange, dozens of churches and schools and civic organizations, had returned across 60 years to something approaching the empty high valley that Bob Womack had grazed his cattle in before 1890. The head frames were mostly gone, salvaged for metal during the wartime drives, or simply left to rot and collapse into the hillsides. The opera house that had hosted Sarah Bernhardt was dark and deteriorating. The financial exchange was a storage facility. The streets of Bennett Avenue, built to accommodate the commerce of 50,000 people, held the modest businesses of a community 1/100th that size, their storefronts occupying a fraction of the space that had been filled. The schools were still open, teaching children whose families had decided, across 3 generations of decline, that this place was worth staying in. The churches were still holding services for congregations that grew smaller every decade, but remained. The newspaper that had been covering the district since the rush years was still publishing, though in a reduced form for the readers who remained. These surviving institutions were not symptoms of failure. They were expressions of the community's refusal to accept that the decline was final. A refusal that was, in its own way, as stubborn and determined as Bob Womack's decade of searching for gold that everyone said wasn't there. The people who stayed in Cripple Creek through the long decades of the 20th century's middle years were maintaining something that deserved to be maintained. A connection to a history, a relationship to a landscape of genuine power and beauty, a community identity built at extraordinary cost over the course of a remarkable 15 years that was worth preserving even in diminished form. They were also, simply, people for whom this place was home, whose roots here were deep enough that the economics of departure, however compelling in the abstract, did not outweigh the human costs of leaving. In 1991, Colorado legalized limited stakes casino gambling in Cripple Creek, Central City, and Black Hawk. The legislature's intention was to use the economic engine of gambling to fund the preservation of the historic architecture that distinguished these communities and that had been deteriorating for decades without adequate resources for its maintenance. The casinos brought revenue and tourists, and the complicated bargain that gambling economies offer distressed communities. Real money in exchange for a transformation of character that comes with its own costs. Historic buildings were converted into gaming halls. Parking structures appeared on lots where Victorian commercial buildings had stood. The noise and light of the casino district extended the community's active hours in ways that the quiet of the previous decades had not. The population stabilized and increased, reaching roughly 1,200 by the early 2000s, and holding there. The economic anxiety that had characterized the community for most of the 20th century was replaced by a different kind of economic anxiety. The dependence on gambling revenue that is, in its own way, as fragile as the dependence on gold production had been. The gold is not entirely gone. The Cripple Creek and Victor Gold Mining Company operates an open-pit heap leach operation on the outskirts of the district, processing low-grade ore from surface deposits that the original miners would have left as waste rock, too poor in gold content to be worth carrying underground. The operation uses modern equipment and a handful of employees to produce modest amounts of gold from material that the men who built the city would not have recognized as ore. It is a connection to the district's original identity, the same geology, the same gold, the same mountains, that exists more in principle than in practice. The human scale of it, the economic meaning of it, the social weight of it, bear no relationship to what gold mining meant in this valley a century ago. 1,200 people, a few casinos, an open pit on the hill, the brick buildings on Bennett Avenue standing in the thin mountain air at 9,500 feet, holding the memory of 50,000. The tunnels underground, tens of thousands of feet of them, carved by men whose names are mostly forgotten. Dark, flooded, silent, the mountain is still there. Pikes Peak still rises above the basin on clear days, the same peak that the prospectors of 1859 named their impossible dream after. The creek still runs. The meadow grasses still come up every spring through the remnants of winter. The landscape endures with the indifference of geological time, entirely unconcerned with what the humans who passed through it built and lost and left behind. What the humans built was extraordinary. What they lost was partly inevitable and partly chosen. The gold ran out. That was inevitable. The labor war that destroyed the community's human infrastructure before the gold ran out, that was chosen. The deportations that loaded skilled workers into cattle cars and dumped them on state lines, that was chosen. Every decision that prioritize the short-term financial interests of the mine owners over the long-term health of the community they had built. Those were chosen. The slow fade of Cripple Creek was not purely natural. It was shaped at every stage by the decisions of specific people with specific interests and specific power. Understanding that is not about assigning blame at a distance of a century. It is about understanding how places like Cripple Creek actually work, and why the story of their decline is never simply the story of a resource running out.